and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, with the truce shaken by airstrikes during the course of the weekend, and with Israel and Hamas accusing each other of violations, President Trump says the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza is still in place. We ask, what do mediators need to do to ensure it doesn't collapse? And how much aid is getting through to the people of Gaza? Plus, we'll take a look at the situation in Ukraine and try to decode the latest talks between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. Hello and welcome to the programme. The ceasefire in Gaza is fragile and has been severely tested in recent days. Well, tensions flared after Israel launched a wave of airstrikes on the Strip, accusing Hamas of firing at Israeli soldiers. That's a claim the militant group denies. Well, according to local authorities, nearly 100 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since the start of the ceasefire. And Gaza residents say they fear more violence despite the truce that was agreed on the 10th of October. Let's take a look.
تم انتشال عدد من الشهداء من هذا المكان. حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل. هاي الواحد.
Well, footage released by the Israeli Defense Ministry earlier on today shows the army marking the so-called yellow line. That's the boundary beyond which its forces have pulled back in Gaza. Well, that leaves Israel in control of roughly half the territory, including its borders, but not the main cities. Well, last week, the IDF said its troops opened fire on several suspects who crossed the yellow line. Rights groups, meanwhile, are warning that the yellow line has become a deadly zone for Palestinians. Well, despite Israel and Hamas accusing each other of breaking the truce, the US President Donald Trump insists the ceasefire is holding and that it's in place following on from those deadly strikes.
We want to make sure that it's going to be very peaceful with Hamas. And as you know, they've been quite rambunctious. They've been doing some shooting, and we think maybe the leadership isn't involved in that, some rebels within, but either way, it's going to be handled properly. It's going to be handled toughly, but properly.
Is the ceasefire still in place?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
OK, we can speak now to Gershon Baskin, who's a Middle East peace and hostage negotiator. He joins us from Jerusalem. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. We've heard from the White House saying that they're optimistic that the ceasefire deal won't collapse. This, of course, in the context of a weekend with some violence. Are you as confident as the White House?
I'm actually pretty confident, and mainly because the White House is confident. Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner are here in Israel now, and they're meeting with all the Israeli officials, making sure that Israel is locked into this door, making sure that Netanyahu's hands are tied and can't continue to make the breaches that have been made since the deal was done. In fact, they are communicating with the Qataris, the Egyptians, and the Turks to make sure that Hamas is in line. We heard an official announcement from Hamas, in fact, that the incident that took place yesterday was not done by Hamas, not given orders to do it. We don't know all the background of what happened here, but already too many people have been killed in Gaza after the ceasefire was made, and Hamas didn't meet its commitment to release all the hostages because there are 16 deceased hostages whose bodies are yet to be found. Hamas should have let it be known when they signed the agreement that they wouldn't be able to retrieve all the deceased hostages within 72 hours, because that's what they agreed to. So we've had mutual breaches here and accusations on both sides. And I think that really what we have seen is that the parties, both Israel and Hamas, are testing to what degree the Americans are willing to weigh down heavily and make sure that this continues.
Just on the issue of the deceased hostages, I mean, is there a sense in Israel that Hamas was not honest when it brokered this deal? Or is there a sense, as it seems to be in the United States, that given the amount of rubble and the conditions on the ground in Gaza, it's a very difficult mission to try to recover those bodies? What's the feeling, do you think, in Israel?
Yeah, for sure, the Israelis who have no trust in Hamas and believe that Hamas is always playing games immediately accused Hamas of playing games with the hostage bodies and not making do and planning to drag this out forever and ever. On the first night, when the hostage bodies were supposed to be returned to Israel, they returned 4, and Israel was already accusing Hamas of breaching the agreement, and the Minister of Defense and people in the army and the cabinet were saying, let's go back to war. And I contacted Mr. Witkoff and told him this is very serious. The Israelis are talking about going back to war, and he wanted me to give him quotes and who was saying what, and he said, we're going to shut this down, not let it happen. I wrote a piece the next day, and I published it widely in the Israeli media and internationally, that there are objective realities that we need to take into account. Hamas is controlling less than 50% of the Gaza Strip. There could be a lot of bodies in the parts of the Gaza Strip where the Israelis are in charge. Hamas has no forensic laboratory. Hamas doesn't have the heavy machinery to dig underneath buildings. We know that there are thousands of Gazans who are unaccounted for, who are presumed to be buried underneath the buildings that Israel bombed. There's no reason not to believe that there shouldn't be Israeli bodies there as well. In addition to the reality that most of the Hamas commanders who were in charge of burying the bodies of Israeli hostages are no longer alive because Israel killed them. So there aren't people around to actually know the location of all the bodies. And this is a job that's going to take a long time to do. And at the end of the day, God forbid, there may be bodies that won't be able to be recovered at all. And this is also something that I've said for more than a year and a half. We have to be ready for that possibility.
Right, and one of the things you've been saying, and I saw this on your social media, words to the effect that here we are, 10 days on from the signing of the deal in Sharm el-Sheikh, and you seem to be saying that that very deal could have been struck quite a long time ago, much sooner, and obviously tens of thousands of lives would have been saved. Why don't you think it was struck so much sooner than, in fact, it was in the end?
Yeah, there are 2 main reasons I would say. One is that the Israeli prime minister didn't want to end the war, and it was an end of war deal that was given to me in writing by Hamas in Arabic and English with a voice message saying we agreed to this deal to end the war, to release all the hostages in the first days of the ceasefire agreement, a gradual Israeli withdrawal over a 3-week period of time that was specified. And Hamas said that they would no longer govern Gaza as well. But the prime minister of Israel wasn't ready to end the war. He wanted to keep this war going for as long as possible. And the second reason was that President Biden was in the White House and he was not willing to force Netanyahu to end the war. It was something that it was obvious that Trump would be willing to do if the circumstances were right. My message to Hamas leadership from January 20th, when Trump entered the White House, is that you have to stop imagining that you're negotiating with Israel. You have to understand that you're sitting in a room across the table from Donald Trump. And if you get Donald Trump to accept what you're willing to do, Donald Trump will force the Israelis to end the war. And that's, in fact, what happened.
And what is the mindset of negotiators in Hamas? I mean, you've dealt with these people, you've spoken to them directly, and you're making it sound as though you still maintain some degree of contact. What sort of a mindset are we dealing with? If it's Donald Trump on one side of the table, give us a sense of who's on the other.
Things have changed over time. They were different after October 7th. They were different after September 9th when the Israelis tried to kill them all. Prior to September 9th, we were talking about American guarantees, presidential guarantees. We were talking about arranging a direct meeting between the Americans, between Witkoff and the Hamas negotiating team that would take place in Istanbul. After September 9th, when Israel tried to kill them, and Hamas believed that Trump had to give a green light to that, the American guarantees also lost their value and their credibility. The talks with Hamas are very, very difficult because, one, a lot of their leadership isn't alive anymore. The key decision makers aren't alive anymore. Those who are alive today don't know for sure. I think they never said this to me, but this is my assessment. Don't know for sure if what they agree to can be accepted in Gaza. They don't have direct control over Gaza. And I would say, from what I understand, there's a lot of deep discussion within the Hamas leadership on future direction. I think that Hamas needs to know that they don't have an armed struggle which is viable anymore. They're not going to free Palestine by killing Israelis. They brought about the destruction of Gaza. I think that they know that most of the 2 million plus Gazans don't want to see Hamas anymore. They blame Israel and hold Hamas responsible. So I think that they are in deep crisis without a clear direction of what they should do, or whether or not they can even maintain a leadership position within the Palestinian national movement.
And yet, Gershon, we saw them last week carrying out, well, we didn't see them, but we were given reports about it and shown images of public executions taking place in Gaza. We're told by Hamas, collaborators, other people deemed to be criminals by Hamas were executed in the streets. What are they trying to do there, do you think? Are they trying to show people in Gaza who's in charge?
Look, I think that we need to recognize that the Hamas commanders who are alive in Gaza and are still working there are not political leaders or even military leaders. They're tier 3, 4, and 5 of the Hamas leadership because all the more superior guys were killed. A lot of the fighters there are not disciplined or trained. They're not part of Ezzedin al-Qassam. They weren't the Nukhba elite fighting force. They're a bunch of kids, 17, 18-year-olds who were handed a gun and $200 or $300 and said, "You're with us." And the commanders there are doing things that are unimaginable. I wrote to some of the Hamas leaders and I said, after all you've been through over the last 2 years, the sight of seeing Palestinians killing other Palestinians is disgraceful. I'm not sure that the Hamas leadership can stop it. One of the things that Israel did over the last months is something that occupiers often do, occupying armies often do, is that they find criminal elements who can be bought and compromised, and they give them money and they give them weapons, and they go and fight against the enemy of the occupier, and that's what we have happening there. And we have lawless people who have taken the law into the hands with guns and are executing. And some of these gangs have executed Hamas people, and the Hamas people we saw on television executing these gangs, and they're trying to assert their authority and their power and threatening other Palestinians and making them scared. And Palestinians are scared because the majority of Palestinians in Gaza are not combatants and don't have guns and are innocent victims of a terrible regime of Hamas for all those years and of a brutal war fought by Israel, committing war crimes and crimes against humanity for 2 years on the Gaza people, making Gaza uninhabitable. So this is really tragic, and this is why we need the new Palestinian government. We need the new Palestinian police force. There are more than 10,000 Palestinian cadets who have been trained in Jordan and Egypt over the last months, ready to be deployed, but they need a governmental structure to work under. And this week, we should hopefully see a Security Council resolution that will give this whole agreement international legitimacy and legality and provide the mandate for the establishment of the multinational stabilization force that will go to Gaza and help to stabilize everything.
I want to ask you, because you've also been tweeting about it, about the CBS 60 Minutes interview that Witkoff and Kushner gave that was aired on Sunday. I wonder how it's gone down in Israel, because in that interview, for example, Witkoff seemed to open up about how he built some sort of a personal rapport with Khalil al-Hayya, and something that Kushner described as being absolutely pivotal, that sort of human element, both talking about how as fathers, they'd lost sons. How did that go down? And how do you think lasting bridges have been built here between those two men that can be perhaps valuable in the future?
That's a hard question, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know if Witkoff has an intention of trying to continue to communicate directly with Khalil al-Hayya, or he'll continue to work through the mediators, primarily the Qataris and the Turks and the Egyptians. It would be really interesting to see if a personal relationship did develop between them, those two, because there's still more work to do. But primarily the relationships that need to develop between the American team are with the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, because they remain the international legal address for the Palestinian people. And even if the Palestinian Authority won't govern Gaza, it needs to be appointed some way or another and linked in some way or another to the Palestinian leadership. Also, when we down the road get to the hopeful process of negotiating a two-state solution, it will have to be with the elected representatives of the Palestinian people, who I presume will not be the Hamas leadership. But personal relationships are very important. I've always believed that politics is personal, and that's very good. I think that the Israelis are quite upset that a direct meeting took place. The Israelis censored out on our television the reality of the room where the deal was signed at 2 o'clock in the morning, or initialed at 2 o'clock in the morning, that the Israeli delegation was sitting across from the Hamas delegation in the same room, and that was unprecedented. And I think the more important, unprecedented thing that's about to happen is an international presence in Gaza. This is something that the Israelis have opposed for 78 years. the internationalization of the conflict. Israel never agreed there would be a foreign presence in the territories that Israel occupies, and there's going to be a rather large multinational stabilization force in Gaza, which will prevent Israel from attacking Gaza again and should prevent Hamas from attacking Israel as well.
I mean, you're making it sound like Israel, everything that's happened has been very much against the will of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that he's been sort of dragged into this very much against his will. And obviously aid has resumed into Gaza today, having been briefly suspended. And again, that is apparently the result of US pressure. I don't know if that's true or not. So
that's definitely true. And another thing that's really important to note is that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation disappeared. It's not there anymore in Gaza.
Where's it gone?
It evaporated.
Was it ever there?
Yes, it was there. It was in charge of distributing international aid for months with American military support. The Israelis protected them. We know that lots of Palestinians died trying to get that aid. They had 4 distribution points, and then I think they expanded it to 6 or to 8. But that's in a reality that before the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was an Israeli-American, mostly evangelical Christian idea, before the GHF, there were 400 distribution points for humanitarian aid in Gaza. So the GHF could never do the job. And the minute that this agreement was signed, the GHF personnel disappeared, the distribution points disappeared, and the aid is being distributed once again through the international organizations. There are difficulties. A lot of these international organizations need to be re-registered with the Israelis, and the Israelis are making difficulty. But at the end of the day, what needs to happen is that the Rafah crossing between Egypt and Gaza needs to become the official crossing point for people and for goods, with the European inspection mechanism that will be brought there. That's part of the agreement. It needs to be more robust than it was in 2005 to prevent smuggling of weapons and materials to produce weapons. But in reality, if this blockade on Gaza is going to end, and it has to end, because if it just continues, we'll only end up going to war again, there has to be a kind of open border between Egypt and Gaza. And the Egyptians need to treat the Gazans in the same way that they treat every other foreign national, not some special relationship that they can't enter Egypt, they can't travel via Egypt, they can't visit Egypt. It needs to be a two-way passage as an international border crossing.
Just lastly, Gershon, just before we wrap up, I mean, obviously another busy week for diplomacy when it comes to Gaza and the deal that's been struck and keeping it alive. Witkoff and Kushner are back in Israel. We understand the Vice President, J.D. Vance, is expected in Israel during the coming days. I want to just wrap up by asking you, what do you think they need to do? What have they got to get right? And what does the Trump administration need to do to make sure this ceasefire deal absolutely does not collapse?
Well, the first thing is to make sure that the Israelis understand that under no situation does Israel have a green light to renew the war, that every breach of the agreement by Hamas can be dealt with by the mediators, by the Americans. If some kind of military response is going to be used by Israel, it should be measured and pinpointed. And I think that the Americans will paint pretty clear boundaries for the Israelis of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Of course, Israel cannot allow Hamas to renew the war. And if Hamas continues to pose a threat to Israel, then I'm sure that the Americans will give a green light to Israel to respond appropriately. The second thing that they need to do is deal with the issue of the deployment of the creation of the Palestinian technocratic temporary government for Gaza, the deployment of the Palestinian police force, the UN Security Council resolution. A lot of things that the American side is already working on is getting those financial commitments to rebuild Gaza, to create the mechanism. This peace board that Trump talked about, I think, is going to be very engaged in the whole issue of reconstruction and the use of the money that's going to be raised by the international community and who's going to have access to it and what kind of planning is going to be done. There's an emergency situation in Gaza. Winter is coming. It's a cold, wet winter in Gaza. 2 million people don't have housing. They have to clear rubble, make space. We're building temporary housing, bring in 400,000 tents, I heard something like that is needed now, or caravans, and they need to renew the electricity system and the water system. All these things have to be done very quickly, and I think the Americans are going to really have their eyes on that ball and going to try to move it forward all the time. Before we talk about expanding the Abraham Accords and bigger peace between Israel and the other Arab neighbors, we really have to deal with stabilizing the situation in Gaza and making sure that Israel doesn't have a reason to restart the war.
Okay, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed, Gershon Baskin. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Dr. Alon Liel, who is a former Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry and also Israel's former ambassador to South Africa. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, sir. I just want to start by asking you, what's your understanding of the state of the ceasefire right now?
I see the ceasefires continuing. We had this exchange of fire in the last 24 hours with 2 Israeli casualties and quite a lot of bombing. But I see it as an incident that is happening as a result of this clarity of certain things, of the location. And I don't see it as a breach by both sides. I don't think, at least speaking from the Israeli end, that Israel has the possibility to break the ceasefire. I mean, the political, diplomatic possibility to break the ceasefire. As long as the Americans want to keep it, we will keep it, even if we have local incidents from time to time. The whole thing was imposed on Israel, and the continuation of the ceasefire and hopefully ending the war will also be imposed on Israel.
It's quite interesting, the difference in narratives when you hear Israel saying, Hamas has blatantly violated the truce. And then President Trump says, well, they might not have been involved. It might not be Hamas. Do you think we've entered a new phase here where it used to be Israel, calling out Hamas all the time? Do you think perhaps we've entered a new phase where perhaps President Trump says, maybe not so fast, maybe it isn't them? How do you see the narrative changing?
Look, Israel and Hamas are the two enemies fighting each other, but Israel and Hamas are not at the moment the decision makers regarding what's happening in Gaza and what will happen in Gaza in the future. So these declarations or statements by the side on who broke the ceasefire are almost irrelevant. I think it's Kushner and Witkoff who will decide if it was a breach or not, and it was the President Trump who will decide if he wants the ceasefire to go on or not. There might be a certain point in which President Trump will give up and decide that this is not a real ceasefire and give us a free hand to continue the war. But as long as the President and his colleagues, the other mediators, as Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey want the ceasefire to hold, it will hold. So if it's not a matter of narrative, we always will see we'll never trust Hamas, and we'll always say Hamas is ill intentioned and they will not trust us. And the narrative of the Hamas will be, of course, very negative, and their narrative will be negative, but it doesn't matter. What matters is what will happen on the ground, and we are not the decision makers on the big picture regarding what's happening on the ground.
So the mediators, Witkoff and Kushner, have arrived back in Israel. Quite a lot to talk about there, but first of all, what would you say are their top priorities right now to make sure the ceasefire does stay in place?
Yeah, first we must say that Kushner and Witkoff had an interview on 60 Minutes that shocked Israel. I mean, they in fact admitted that the United States is speaking with Hamas. They admitted that they were surprised by the Qatar attack. They were furious by the Qatar attack. So when they come now, as I see it, the prestige of President Trump hangs with the ending of this war. They are here to guarantee, first of all, that the sides will not shoot each other, that as many bodies as possible will be returned by Hamas, and I hear that another one will be returned soon. So it will be only 15 bodies left there. So they're there to first of all guard the ceasefire and ensure the war is over, and then they understand very well that the faster they will move into stabilizing the situation in Gaza, into handing the authority to somebody else than Hamas, then there'll be less incidents, and the sooner Hamas will be disarmed voluntarily or not voluntarily, then they can stabilize the situation and maybe one day move to stage 3, which is talks between Israel and Palestinians. I don't see this possible at this stage.
Okay, and just on the subject of the hostages' bodies, as you say, one more body may be handed over fairly soon. And clearly, with bombs still landing on Gaza as they were during the course of the weekend, very difficult to locate bodies under the rubble, even without the bombs. And even on that particular issue, President Trump sounds much more understanding than Israel. Israel saying, hand over the bodies or you know, we'll cut off the aid, or making some sort of a threat. President Trump sounds a lot more understanding of the reality on the ground in Gaza than perhaps some in Prime Minister Netanyahu's entourage. What do you read into that?
We Israelis, we treat the issues of the bodies that were not returned yet emotionally. We are emotionally, all of us, emotionally involved. We know the families. I don't think there is an Israeli that watched television in the last 2 years and doesn't know the families involved. They were all the time on the screens. There were demonstrations. It's really touched the heart of each one of us, and we treat it with lots of emotions. President Trump is treating the issue rationally. When you are rational, you know how much bombarding, how much destruction, and you know that probably many of them are under the rubbles and things, houses, probably ruins have to be evacuated, and it will take time. So he treats it rationally. We are very lucky. I mean, I think for those who want to see the end of the war, that he, with his rational thinking, can impose on us what to do. I think the atmosphere in Israel in the first 2-3 days after the agreement was signed was shocking. When we heard only 4 bodies were returned, people were furious. The atmosphere was, let's launch the war, let's restart the war. But then the signal came from Washington, and these rational messages reached the Israeli public. And I think the atmosphere now is more rational, even with the Israelis, and I understand it will take time. And with the Americans here and the special forces that will search for the bodies, we will probably have more of them in the future. So I hope this will not be a huge obstacle in the near future.
And Ambassador, obviously with the living hostages now back in Israel, I'm wondering whether that gives Israel more opportunities on the ground in Gaza to do things it couldn't do before. For example, the Israelis say they've dismantled several kilometers of tunnels in Gaza. Is that something that's now easier for Israel to do from a military point of view, do you think, given that they can be sure there are no living Israeli hostages inside?
Look, I'm sure that militarily we still have targets on the ground and their tunnels and so on. Politically, we don't have the ability to handle it. We can, from time to time, respond and explain very well to the Americans that this was triggered by what Hamas did or something like that. We cannot relaunch the war. even if the hostages, the live hostages are here, and will feel probably more comfortable when we attack, that we will not injure them or, God forbid, kill them, and like it was in the past, we have no ability to relaunch the war. It's not only Trump, it's the whole world. The whole world is backing Trump with this ceasefire and end of war. And we saw the picture in Sharm el-Sheikh. The 4 countries that signed were in front: the United States, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. And there were 40 or 42 leaders, prominent leaders on this globe, like Macron and Starmer and others, and Meloni, standing behind and backing it. So it's not only that Trump's ended the war, it's the world ended the war. Israel, in its shape now, with this international status that we are having now, cannot go against the world. We cannot continue this tsunami or enable this tsunami, diplomatic tsunami or volcano that erupted, especially in Europe, to continue, because we'll find ourselves on our own in this world.
We heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu this afternoon saying that during the course of Sunday, 153 tons of bombs were dropped on Gaza. I'm just wondering, when you hear the Prime Minister say something like that, why is he saying it? Is he trying to please a certain audience within Israel, do you think?
Yeah, you are dragging me into internal politics here in Israel. First of all, we were sure we will not have casualties anymore. And you know, the Israeli public is extremely, extremely sensitive to casualties. And we had 2 people killed. And he wanted to show the Israeli public that we still have the ability to respond, especially if we have casualties, but even if we trace attempts to damage our security. It is directly related to the fact that Netanyahu has to explain his base. Why did he end the war? He wants to show his base that ending the war doesn't mean fully ending hostilities, that he still has a free hand to continue. And this is the reason he agreed for the whole deal, that he still can continue an attack like he does in Lebanon. So it can work for a while. It cannot change the overall picture. And it has a lot to do with internal politics, because when we come to internal politics, ending the war without defeating Hamas is something that Netanyahu pays a price, political price for. But the visit of Trump and the returning of the hostages are balancing this. And I don't think Netanyahu of today is more in a worse political situation than before the deal. I think the big hug, public hug, that he got from Trump, who is very popular in Israel, is helping him politically and in fact saving him politically.
Okay, so you're saying on balance, Prime Minister Netanyahu is neither stronger nor weaker politically within Israel than he was 10 days ago?
He's stronger. Look, again, if we go and check what he promised to the Israeli public, it was not fulfilled. Also on the issue of who runs Gaza, or half of Gaza at the moment, Hamas is still in control. Also on the issue that the 20 points agreement speaks on moving toward negotiations, mentioning even the word Palestinian state. So these are very, very difficult things for him. But his base, the political base of Netanyahu, is ready to go with him no matter what happens. He is the Messiah, he is the magician, and the support of his base to Netanyahu is very emotional. So they don't try to settle a political account for him for not keeping up his promises regarding destroying Hamas and changing dramatically the running of Gaza or the rule of Gaza. But on the other end, so he's not paying a heavy price. On the other end, this Trump visit, the leader of the world, coming to our Knesset and for an hour and 5 minutes, praising Netanyahu, hugging and kissing every Israeli that was involved in the deal, is strengthening. We see the polls, and the polls show that Netanyahu of today is stronger politically than Netanyahu before the agreement.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, obviously the ceasefire deal looks very fragile. We saw that at the weekend. Just briefly, are you optimistic it's going to hold?
Yes. You see, Trump is not the sole mediator. Trump cannot be the mediator between Israel and Hamas. He's so close to us that there is no ability for somebody who is so biased and one-sided to be the mediator. But he did a very clever thing by upgrading Turkey and Qatar into this mediation triangle. And this is the triangle. Egypt is also there, but the balancing of the triangle is the United States on one hand, Qatar and Turkey on the other hand. And these are the three countries that have the ability to see that Israel, handled by the United States, and Hamas, handled by Turkey and Qatar, will go on with the ceasefire. And I think the prestige of the mediators, all 3 or 4 mediators, is hanging there. They have a lot to lose here if this will collapse, especially Trump. Trump will become an international joke if next week we go back to the war. So I think, in addition to the fact that I already mentioned that Israel is very weak internationally now, I am optimistic about the ceasefire. I'm much, much less optimistic on the ability to move into a further step that will bring Israel and Palestine into the negotiating room.
Okay, well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Alon Liel.
Thank you for it.
We can speak now to Ghaith Al-Omari, who's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a former advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, sir. I'd just like to start by asking you, we're about 10 days since the ceasefire deal was agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh. What is your assessment of what the overall state of that ceasefire is?
I mean, by and large, I think it still holds. We are seeing a lot of uncertainty and volatility. But to be honest, that's typical. I mean, it's typical at the beginning of any ceasefire where you have a degree of uncertainty, a degree of breakdown of command and control, and the sides pushing to kind of figure out what the boundaries are of what they can get away with. But that said, the U.S. still is very, very involved. The momentum continues to be there. And by and large, I am actually optimistic.
I mean, some of the Israeli guests we've spoken to have suggested that the Israeli Prime Minister really didn't want this deal. He had it sort of rather forced upon him. Do you think there was an element of that on the Palestinian side, or do you think by and large on the Palestinian side everyone did want a deal?
No, I think this holds true for the Palestinian side, specifically for Hamas. Hamas did not want this deal. If you look at what Hamas was asking for just a few weeks ago, full Israeli withdrawal, etc., they did not get that. However, I think what was special here is the U.S. pushed Netanyahu to accept what he was unwilling to accept before, and the Arab countries pushed Hamas. That's why you need constant engagement by the guarantors, because both sides have reasons to kind of not stick to the ceasefire. And unless the pressure is maintained, I fear that we might end up with a backsliding.
One of our earlier guests suggested this same deal, almost, to the letter, could have been signed off on, 12 months ago, and obviously tens of thousands of lives would have been saved. Do you think that was the case?
Maybe similar terms might have been available a few months ago, but I think the political moment was not available. You reach a deal when both sides are tired, feel a degree of internal and external pressure, and I think this was just not the case a year ago. Things have changed now. I think in Israel we were starting to see exhaustion and opposition to the war, and in Gaza we're starting to see people, including Hamas members, were actually saying enough is enough. I think there was a political moment that was right, and I think this is kind of why it happened right now. It's less about the terms, more about the moment.
So obviously 10 days on since that deal was agreed. I mean, do you think it has now faced its gravest test so far? Is that what we saw during the course of the weekend?
Not yet. I'm afraid not yet. We're still at this kind of moment, and I think until we see the international community under U.S. leadership, but also with Arab partnership, resolve some of the kind of what we call phase 2 issues. Who's going to be, is there going to be an international force? Who's going to be in this international force? What are we going to do with Hamas disarmament? Creating a civilian alternative to Hamas through this board of peace and a technocratic Palestinian government. Until these things are in place, I believe there will be a degree of volatility and a degree of fragility in the deal. So I don't think we are in safe waters yet until these things happen.
So clearly, I mean, Hamas have made it very clear, haven't they? They've said we reject any foreign administration of Gaza. And I'm just wondering how we get to the next stage of President Trump's plan.
Actually, there are a lot of competing approaches to it. We see a number of processes happening in parallel. For example, in the coming days, Egypt is going to be convening a intra-Palestinian dialogue. And the theory of the case here is that all of these things, in terms of the civilian alternative and security, can only be done through a Palestinian dialogue and with Hamas's acquiescence. Yeah, pressured acquiescence, but acquiescence nevertheless. But we see something different happening on the American side, where they're trying to get a UN Security Council resolution to that effect. The problem we have, by and large, is, there was a rush to get the ceasefire, and it's fully understandable. There was a moment that no one wanted to lose, but that meant that so many uncertainties remain in the future. And unless U.S. diplomacy comes and basically brings all of these different tracks together, I fear that we might end up with a situation where key players are playing in cross purposes. That's why I think the visit by Witkoff and Kushner today, and then Vance tomorrow, both to Israel, but then later on to Egypt, is key in terms of synchronizing the international community. Otherwise, we might end up in a standstill while Hamas continues to kind of consolidate its power on the ground.
I want to ask you a bit more about this intra-Palestinian dialogue that you mentioned there that's being hosted by Egypt. I mean, the stated purpose is, quote, to unify the Palestinian factions. I mean, is one of those factions Hamas, or indeed what's left of Hamas? Because we're given to understand that at a senior level, there's not a lot left when it comes to the senior ranks of Hamas.
Look, when we say intra-Palestinian dialogue, what we really mean is dialogue between Hamas and Fatah, these two parties. Everyone else is window dressing. And while Hamas certainly had lost much of its senior leadership, it still has a clear leadership structure, whether it is Khalil Hayya who's going to be leading that, or Khalid Mish'al in the background, etc. And of course, the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah movement on the other side. I think the Egyptian case is that Hamas is a real force that you just simply cannot ignore. In this position, they are also being supported by Qatar and Turkey. But this will create problems as it relates to Israel and the United States, both of whom see Hamas as an illegitimate player. Actually, the 20-point plan specifically talks about Hamas not being part of any arrangements in the future. So these are the kind of two competing sets of interests. But certainly, when Egypt talks about intra-Palestinian dialogue, it really talks about Hamas and the Palestinian Authority.
Since you mentioned Khalil al-Hayya there, I just wanted to ask you what you made. I don't know if you saw the 60 Minutes interview that Kushner and Witkoff gave. It was aired during the course of the weekend on CBS. I mean, Witkoff seemed to suggest he built quite a bond with Khalil al-Hayya. I mean, a very unlikely set of circumstances for two men to bond. They bonded over the fact they both lost children for, under very different circumstances. But how valuable do you think that sort of a bond could potentially be in taking peace to the next level?
Look, it's both valuable and risky. I mean, it's valuable because, look, at the end of the day, the only guarantees for Hamas in terms of Israel not resuming the war are the guarantees coming from the United States. These are not concrete, tangible guarantees. These are guarantees based on whether or not Hamas trusts the United States. And so far, Hamas has been willing to trust the commitment presented by Witkoff and by, obviously, President Trump. So this is key. This is key to pushing things, especially in moments of crisis. But there is a risk. And the risk is that Hamas is considered as a terrorist organization by US law, by European law, by many Arab countries. And there is a risk if Hamas feels that it is being mainstreamed, if it gets acceptance as a legitimate interlocutor by the United States, because if it's convinced of this is the case, then it might lead it to take more hardline positions. There is a real concern that Hamas, after the, frankly, terror attack that it conducted on October 7th, might end up reaping political benefits. So this is the thing that the US has to balance, how to create trust with Hamas to move it forward without giving it a degree of legitimacy that it's, frankly, it doesn't deserve.
Okay, so just lastly, I mean, how do you rate the chances of the various diplomatic teams that are arriving in the region during the course of this week? I mean, Witkoff and Kushner are already back. J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, are probably heading there later on in the week. I mean, what have they all got to get right this week to make sure everything stays on track?
I mean, the first thing they have to get right is basically, in the most immediate sense, tell Israel and tell Hamas not to overreact to perceived violations from the other side. Again, there's a degree of uncertainty right now. There's a fear of things spinning out of control, as we almost saw happen this weekend. So I think this is the most immediate task, and I'm optimistic when it comes to this. I'm less optimistic when it comes to basically bringing shape into phase 2 or day 2 or whatever you want to call it. I think things are not right now for this, and I am concerned that in the coming weeks we'll be seeing something in in Gaza similar to what we see in Lebanon, where the war is over, but reconstruction has not begun, and a lower degree of violence is persistent, whereby we will see Israel attacking Gaza every couple of days, and Hamas also pushing the boundaries. So I'm optimistic in the short term, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the medium and long term.
Okay, well, we appreciate you taking the time to share that with us. Ghaith Al-Omari, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Now turning our attention to Ukraine, and President Volodymyr Zelensky has been trying to get his hands on Tomahawk cruise missiles, but so far without success. Well, unlike drones, these missiles can fly low and hit deep into enemy territory with precision. And they're also relatively affordable at around $2 million each. Well, President Zelensky says they will help Ukraine strike further into Russia, but President Trump is holding off, saying that the US needs them first.
Well, that's a problem. We need Tomahawks, and we need a lot of other things that we've been sending over the last 4 years to Ukraine. We've been, we gave them a lot. Now we have a different situation. We send it to the European Union. They pay for it and all that, and they have plenty of money. But it's beyond the money. We need Tomahawks, and we need a lot of other weapons that we're sending to Ukraine. One of the reasons we want to get this war over is exactly that.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to General Joseph Votel, who's a retired 4-star general and former commander of U.S. Central Command. He joins us from Minnesota. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, General Votel. Just before we talk about Ukraine, I just want to ask you briefly, since we were talking about it with our earlier guests, I mean, how fragile is the ceasefire in the Middle East looking to you right now?
Well, I think first of all, it's good to be with you, Tom. And I think the situation is fragile. I think it always has been fragile. Certainly there was some progress made, over the last 10 days as we've kind of got to this agreement. And there's been some things that have been done, the return of hostages, the return of hostage remains, the removal of some IDF forces from Gaza. But, I think the challenge here is while we've overcome one important milestone here, there's a lot more to be done. And I think that kind of highlights the fragility of this, whether it's the disarmament of Hamas, whether it's any of the demilitarization that has to take place, the transition, the delivery of humanitarian aid. All of these are very, very complicated things, and they are likely to take time, and they're going to take even more time in a very difficult situation like Gaza right now.
Thank you for that, General Votel. Let's talk about Ukraine now. It appears, and many people in Ukraine are speculating, that President Zelensky left his talks with President Trump on Friday more or less empty-handed. He didn't appear to get the Tomahawk missiles that he wanted. I mean, is that how it looks to you? And how much of a setback do you think those talks were for President Zelensky?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly there had been a lot of talk in this country about the potential of providing Tomahawk missiles to the Ukrainians so that they could use them for their own defense and shoring up their operations. So I think there was some expectation that was going to take place. Of course, the dynamics around all of this negotiation, all of the activities taking place at a very high level, I think have come to be seen here. President Trump is clearly talking to both sides and influenced by both sides, and it appears that he is, maybe has stepped back from that original inclination to provide them there, to see if there's another way that this situation could be resolved. So yeah, I'm sure this is very disappointing for the Ukrainians, and again, I think it might be a little bit confusing on the strategic front in terms of where we actually stand with all this.
Yeah, I mean, it looks and sounds like a dramatic change of heart because, according to the Financial Times, President Trump warned President Zelensky that Putin would destroy Ukraine if he didn't agree to Moscow's terms. And then only last month, we heard President Trump saying that Russia was actually a little bit of a paper tiger, and said that Kyiv could win back all of its territory and get Ukraine back in its original form. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic change of heart, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we seem to be moving back and forth between several different end states here that we're focused on. I think it is important in the final analysis to have some strategic continuity, to have some strategic predictability in terms of what our policy looks like. Again, I'm not in the room. I'm not seeing everything. Most of us are not. So I don't know what all the machinations are that are taking place. Certainly, I think the president is talking to both sides and trying to see where he can get the best deal, and I think that involves putting pressure in both directions here with respect to that. So yes, I would agree that it does appear to be a little bit unpredictable here.
I mean, would the Tomahawks have perhaps had the effect of getting the Russians to the negotiating table slightly quicker or on slightly different terms?
Well, I mean, this is a pretty significant weapon system here that can travel a long way and can do some significant damage when it arrives. So the threat of those, the actual employment of those, could certainly have an impact. I think it's always important to appreciate that military means by themselves, without diplomacy, without the information aspects, things, without economic aspects, all of these will likely come up short. So what we really have to do is, these are great weapon systems. They can certainly do a lot. They can help the Ukrainians. But what we really need is we need to bring all of our elements of power together to really create the biggest cumulative effect that we can.
So, I mean, it looks now as though sort of everyone's attention is turning towards Budapest, where there's going to be direct talks, we assume, between Presidents Trump and Putin. President Zelensky saying he could take part if he's invited to those talks. But just before we talk about those talks, does that mean, do you think, this is the end of the road for US military support for Ukraine?
I don't think so. We haven't really stopped any of the arms sales that we've been doing through NATO to get to Ukraine, and that does not appear to have been disrupted. We'll have to see what happens after this next round of high-level discussions here. But I mean, yeah, I think the president is, I think, trying to use all the means available to him, and he is at heart a business person, and that means talking face to face with people. So I think that's what he's attempting to do with all of this. You know, whether it will be successful or not, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Yeah, I mean, right now it appears that our military support in the way that it's being provided is continuing.
Do you see those talks happening, those three men sitting around the table, or do you think it would be more of a case of shuttle diplomacy between the two sides?
My personal belief, I think it will likely be shuffle diplomacy. I don't know that Mr. Putin is anxious to meet with President Zelensky. Perhaps he would be in the presence of President Trump as kind of a mediator between them. That certainly could be a possibility. I mean, we've seen extraordinary things over the last several months that have happened. So I don't want to dismiss anything. My gut feeling tells me that this will likely be like it was the last time. It'll be meetings with both sides in more of a shuttle diplomacy between the two of them.
And what do you think of the choice of the possible venue, Hungary? I mean, it's not exactly a neutral territory as far as Ukraine is concerned, is it?
Well, no, but you know, there are some limitations on where President Putin can travel, and so this may be one of the locations that he can get to. So I don't know all the machinations behind the selection of that particular location, but yeah, I take your point here that this has not been a country that's always been supportive of Ukraine, but it is one that is in a position to host this meeting between our president and Mr. Putin.
So basically, we've got the situation where the US is urging Ukraine to accept Russia's terms to end the war. And I'm just wondering what other parties will be thinking of that and how they'll be advising Ukraine. I mean, what's NATO going to say? What are the European allies going to say? I mean, how do they communicate that to Ukraine in the face of what it appears are zero concessions by the Russians?
Well, I would expect, like we saw the last time around when the president and Mr. Putin met in Alaska, that there will be on the sidelines of all this, there will be meetings with our NATO partners and the European leaders, and with advice to President Zelensky, hopefully advice to our president as well, some input from them in terms of the considerations that ought to go into this discussion. I mean, I think everyone does recognize that ultimately right now, at least the end of this conflict will be reached through some form of mediation. Whether that involves giving up territory or something else, I think that's all to be decided. I think the Europeans, certainly the NATO, has been very pro-Ukraine and is very keen for them not to give up any type of their terrain or land. So you know, we'll see where that goes. I mean, these are really difficult challenges here, and of course the president is stepping into this, trying to bring some coherence around an approach to this, and I'm sure he'll be getting input from a lot of different sides, and a lot of that input will most undoubtedly be conflicting with each other.
General Votel, we heard from Britain's most senior military officer, Field Marshal Lord Richard, saying that Ukraine cannot win this war with Russia, and said that Ukraine should negotiate peace. I mean, is that how it looks to you? And what's your assessment of what's actually happening on the battlefield right now?
Well, my assessment is that neither side is in a position to exact a military victory in this. I mean, it's been stalemated. There's been some gains by the Russians here, and certainly some of their attacks across Ukraine have been pretty devastating to the infrastructure. But Ukraine has also exacted some costs on Russia as well. And so neither side can get to a decisive point. And that was my point earlier, is eventually this is going to have to be negotiated and mediated out. And it's going to be a discussion that ends this, not necessarily a fight here. The Ukrainians are up against a lot of challenges. They are a smaller country population-wise. They are very dependent upon NATO and the United States and others for a lot of their material, and there's some challenges with getting all of that to them. The Russians, on the other hand, are making use of Iranian drones, are making use of North Korean soldiers and North Korean artillery, and they've kind of got the acquiescence of China in supporting this. So both sides have had some challenges associated with all of that. Neither can achieve a military victory at this point. So yes, I think at some point there is going to have to be a negotiation. I think what we're really talking about are what is the framework for that? Does it involve giving up terrain? Is it pulling forces back? Does it include some force in between? I mean, there's a whole bunch of possibilities of this. So I think the conflict is going to end around a table. It's not going to end around a military engagement.
But when people in the United States and in Europe say, look, Ukraine's not our national interest, it's not our national interest, this is Ukraine's national interest, and therefore we have to, take a step back and walk away. I mean, handing victory to the Kremlin isn't just handing victory to the Kremlin, it's also North Korea for some of the military hardware and some of the soldiers on the ground, we understand. It's handing military victory as well, to a certain extent, to Iran, which has been providing some of the drones as well, we're told. I mean, there are broad-reaching implications, aren't there? And not least for Ukraine's neighbors that must be wondering whether it'll be their turn next.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think this is in our national interest. And, as a member of NATO, we certainly have to appreciate the impact that a Russian victory of some sorts in Ukraine would mean for others. I mean, there are other countries there that are in a position where they can very easily be threatened by the Russian juggernaut, so to speak. And so they have to pay attention to that. I do think it's in our interest to make sure that this is resolved in a way that doesn't necessarily reward Russia for their aggressive actions in initiating this war, and that continues to stabilize NATO and send the message that this will not be tolerated. I think we've seen over the last couple months when we saw some incursions of Russian jets into NATO airspace, a very strong response from the NATO countries. So they're definitely on arm, and they understand, I think, what Mr. Putin is up to, and that his goals perhaps don't end with Ukraine, but really end in a much more broader fashion with trying to reestablish the empire that they previously had under the Soviet Union. So I think these are significant interests that are at stake, not just for NATO, but to include the United States here in Eastern Europe.
And just lastly, General Votel, just to wrap up with a comment from that same senior military man I was talking about just a moment ago, Field Marshal Lord Richards. He said, what we have done is, in the case of Ukraine, is to encourage Ukraine to fight, but not given them the means to win. He went on to say that Ukraine's allies have failed Ukraine. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I certainly understand that position. I think we've been overly deliberative over a number of years now in terms of the equipment and the provisioning of stuff that we're giving to them, the limitations we put on them for the employment of some of the systems that have been provided to them. I think these all don't help Ukraine in the long run. I think we've been reluctant to put our the most devastating financial sanctions on Russia. I think we kind of need to be all in on this. And if we really want Ukraine to prevail in this, we need to give them all the tools that they require, and we need to take the handcuffs off them in terms of this. And that, I think, has been a problem. I mean, there certainly are some considerations that had to be taken into consideration. Nobody wanted to get a broader war going here, but in terms of doing that, our approach to that has really, I think, come at the detriment of Ukraine. So yes, I agree with the Field Marshal on that. We needed to provide them with the tools up front and allow them to do what they needed to do.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. General Joseph Votel. Thank you, sir.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.